Good evening, and a very warm welcome to Catholic Theological Union for our Spring Shapiro Lecture. 3 times a year, the Catholic Jewish Studies program at CTU hosts a Shapiro Lecture made possible through the generosity of the Shapiro Family Foundation. For many decades, they have enabled CTU to invite world-renowned scholars to speak on a range of topics related to theology, current issues, and culture. Many of you attending tonight are longtime friends, but for those of you who may be new to CTU, just a brief note on interreligious exchange at CTU. We were founded in 1968 in the wake of the Second Vatican Council, which issued the groundbreaking document Nostra Aetate, the Declaration on the Relation of the Church with Non-Christian Religions. Since our founding, CTU has been very committed to interreligious dialogue, especially through our Catholic Jewish Studies programs and our Catholic Muslim Studies program. We are grateful for the leadership of Father John Polakowski and Rabbi Chaim Perlmutter of blessed memory, 2 of our founding faculty members who established the Catholic Jewish Studies program and who launched the deep and lasting friendships that have been formed between CTU and our Jewish partners in the last 5+ decades. We also remember fondly Nancy Perlmutter, the wife of Rabbi Chaim Perlmutter, who was also present at almost every Shapiro lecture until very recently, and we remember her with fondness and gratitude as she passed on December 14th, just recently at the age of 104. Tonight's Shapiro lecture is part of our 2-day Perlmutter Conference in Jewish Catholic Dialogue, named in honor of Rabbi Chaim Goren Perlmutter, beloved member of our faculty from 1968 until his death in 2001. He also served during that time as rabbi at KAM Isaiah Israel. Since 2018, the Perlmutter Conference has been held in partnership with the University of Notre Dame, and we are grateful especially to Drs. V. Novik for this collaboration. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Malka Zeiger-Simkevich, Director of CTU's Catholic Jewish Studies program and holder of the Crown Ryan Chair in Jewish Studies at CTU, to introduce tonight's esteemed guest lecturer. Malka?
Thank you, Sister Barbara, and good evening. My name is Malka Simkevich, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this year's Spring Shapiro Lecture. Whether you're here with us in person or with us online, we appreciate your joining us to hear our featured speaker, Dr. Sam Lebens. Dr. Lebens is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Haifa who works in a wide range of philosophical areas, including, and I cannot define any of these words, but hopefully you can, and I know Dr. Lebens can, metaphysics, epistemology, the history of early analytic philosophy, the philosophy of literature and fiction, and the philosophy of Judaism. He is also the author of dozens of articles, the co-editor of 3 books, and the author of 4 books, and now I will name their titles: The Principles of Judaism, The Philosophy of Religion, the recently award-winning A Guide for the Jewish Undecided, and I have to take a deep breath before I say this title, Bertrand Russell and the Nature of Propositions, A History and Defense of the Multiple Relation Theory of Judgment. You may have sensed from these diverse titles that Dr. Lebens is committed to exploring difficult subjects before an array of audiences, from academics who work in his specialty to people who are not as familiar with philosophy as an academic discipline. And indeed, those of you who have heard Dr. Lebens speak on a podcast or in a video, or who have read his articles with excellent titles and his many books, they all know that he has a great talent for convincing people that certain topics that you or I might dismiss as esoteric is in fact important, crucial, and accessible. We will leave aside time for questions at the end, but if you are joining us by Zoom, please feel free to post questions or comments in the chat box anytime, or you can send them directly. We'll just put them in the chat and we'll try to get to you. And I will then direct some questions from both the in-person audience and the Zoom audience to Dr. Lebens at the end of our lecture. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sam Lebens.
Thank you very much, Dr. Simkovic. Thank you very much for the kind welcome. It's a great honor to be here and to be delivering the Shapiro lecture. And I'll just jump straight in. I had initially decided that what I would speak about is what it means for one community to be the same community many, many years later. So, for example, it's quite, I think, legitimate to say that Rabbinic Judaism and Catholic Christianity are both continuations of the faith of Second Temple Judaism has evolved in these two different directions, and yet you sometimes get, an interesting detail there is, if you were to compare, maybe it's a controversial comparison, it's not meant to be, to compare the various breakaways from, let's say, the Mormon Church, the Church of the Latter-day Saints, right? Now, in those splinters, each organization claims to be the sole legitimate successor of the real Mormon Church, and they wouldn't recognize the others. And you sometimes have schisms like that. I suppose at one point, soon at the time of the Reformation, there would be serious debates as to whether a non-Catholic Christian is really a Christian and whatever. And I know this, the institution that I'm honored to be speaking at was formed, if I'm not mistaken, after the Second Vatican Council, which, as we were saying, really was a transformational moment in the relationship between the Catholic Church and other religious groups. And what emerges is you get this idea, we are Catholic, but it doesn't necessarily mean that non-Catholic Christians aren't Christians, right? What's interesting about the split, the parting of the ways that happened whenever it did between Judaism and Christianity, is that, and I suppose this is to do with Paul, is that even though Christianity claimed to be, the true religion, and therefore, in a sense, the real or authentic continuation of the law of Moses that Jesus came to embody, or something like that, it didn't ever really come at the expense of saying that the Jews are not the Jews, right? So Paul recognizes that there is still a thing called the Jews, and that Christians don't become, and therefore, so what you have is these interesting questions about what does it mean for one community to be the same community as another, or a different community as another, and when time gets into the picture, it gets even fuzzier. This is a version, you might say, of a question that philosophers are very interested in general about individual people, right? We call it the identity of persons over time. So if you look at the diagram I've just given you, it represents, there's a stage where it's a baby, and a stage where it's a young boy, and an adolescent, a young man, a slightly older strapping man, and a strapping young man, and then a slightly more wizened older gentleman, and yet we want to say that these are all pictures of the same person. And there's something of a philosophical puzzle, because every 7 years or so, pretty much every single cell of the body is regenerated. So it's not that the same person in virtue of having the same cells. I don't have all that much in common with my 6-year-old self. We have very different interests. My 6-year-old self had a much harder time pronouncing words with S's in them than I do. There's all sorts of differences. He had problems, all sorts of problems, thank God, that I don't have. But I have various problems that he didn't have. And the question is, what makes me the same person? Is I could find you dozens of 6-year-olds who are much more similar to that 6-year-old person than I am to that 6-year-old person. What makes me a continuation of that person and not somebody else? We're asking a similar question, but we're asking it about communities. And when it comes to communities, I don't know how I didn't mean to draw on the board, but and it's still there. Oh well. If I knew how to erase. It's on Zoom, isn't it? Hold on a second. There we go. I did it, you see? I did it. Thank you. Anyway, the question when it comes to communities becomes even more complex. And actually, not many philosophers have investigated what we mean when we talk about the identity of a community over time, and what we mean when we say we are the authentic inheritors of a tradition. What sorts of debates are those? A notable exception, and I suppose the beginning of a small tradition of philosophers talking about this is, one second, I'm just moving things around on my screen so I can see. Well, anyway, it's John Williams, who, not the John Williams who wrote the theme tune to Star Wars and was nominated for an Oscar last night and didn't win because everything seemed to have been won by one film. But a different John Williams, who sadly passed away in 2019, who was interested in... Oh, why isn't it working? 1 second. Can somebody... I'm trying to move the slides on. I'm also going to be talking about technology, ironically. No. No. Hello, everybody. I can see all your faces now for a minute. Okay, good. Yes, John Williams was really interested in Confucianism. There's a lot of text here, Malcolm. We were talking about how much text you're allowed on a slide. I told you there would be too much. Anyway, this is a quote from a paper he wrote back in the 1980s. He passed away in 2019, as I said. He said, one of the kinds of issues that interest historians of ideas, in particular Confucian scholars, is a relation that is sometimes called true succession. Some examples of this relation are clear-cut, others less so. Plato was certainly a true successor of Socrates, but one's more hesitant to say that Aristotle was a true successor of Plato. The relation has some interesting features, this relation of being a true successor of somebody else. Nietzsche probably had no true successor. That's an interesting feature. Wittgenstein wasn't even his own true successor, because you have an early Wittgenstein and a later Wittgenstein, and they disagree with each other quite a lot. In fact, I am probably a much truer successor of the early Wittgenstein than later Wittgenstein was. Although Marx was a true successor of Hegel, and Lenin was a true successor of Marx, Lenin was not a true successor of Hegel, which philosophers would describe that as being a non-transitive relation, this relation of being a true successor. Zeno was a true successor of Pythagoras, but so was Parmenides, and Parmenides and Zeno are very, very different thinkers. But I suppose they both have sufficiently enough in common with their teacher Parmenides, with their teacher Pythagoras, to both be called true successors of Pythagoras. Now, the classical tradition that John Williams is interested in had it that Mencius was not a true successor of Confucius, whereas the Neo-Confucian tradition holds that he was. And John Williams wants to arbitrate that debate. John Williams wants to say, what are they arguing about? These classical Confucianists and Neo-Confucianists, what are they arguing about when it comes to Mencius? And they're like, was he a true successor or wasn't he a true successor of Confucius? What does it even mean to be a true successor? David Hillel Rubin wrote a paper, I think it was in 2013, and I think he may have been the first person to cite this paper by John Williams that was otherwise quite obscure. David Hillel Rubin's an interesting person in and of himself. He's a Jewish philosopher. I think he was, I'm not sure if he was raised secular, but he certainly spent a lot of his time as a secular Marxist before becoming religious as an Orthodox Jew. But one thing he was interested in right throughout his philosophical career, whether he was a Marxist or an Orthodox Jew, is this question of identity of traditions over time. So John Williams was talking about individuals. Which individual is a true successor of whom? David Hillel Rubin was more interested in traditions. So you can take a time slice of a tradition. So you could take Roman Catholicism in 2023 and Roman Catholicism in 1522, and you ask, what makes them the same tradition? Williams is interested in succession, which he defines as a relationship between individuals. Hillel Rubin calls the relation he's interested in inheritance, which is supposed to be a relation, I suppose, between time slices of a tradition. Okay. And this is the question he's interested in. How can different parties to a dispute each claim, apparently with at least some justification, that it, but not its rivals, so let's say, I suppose, two splinters of the Mormon church, or take Orthodox Judaism and Conservative Judaism and Reform Judaism, how could it be that the different parties to such a dispute could each claim, apparently with at least some justification, that it, but not its rivals, stands in the same authentic tradition as some earlier representative of that tradition? And in his paper on the topic, he sets out two purposes. First, he wants to develop, or begin to develop, a conceptual structure for dealing adequately with questions of this type. And secondly, he wants to diagnose why is it that such disputes are so intractable. It's not like, a dispute in the sciences you can often just solve with an experiment and you go, turns out they were wrong, they were right? Or you wait for some new evidence to turn up. But the dispute between, let's say, Conservative Judaism and Orthodox Judaism about which is the more authentic representative of the tradition today, it doesn't seem like you're going to be able to just pull a proof out of a hat and kind of solve it. These debates seem to be inherently intractable, and Hillel Rubin wants to give both a conceptual structure for dealing with these debates, but one that hopefully will explain exactly why they're so intractable. Okay, putting the two things together, succession and inheritance. So John Williams had said that person Y, let's call him Wittgenstein, is a true successor of X, let's call X, Russell, if. Now, that's not spelt wrong. Philosophers use a double F for if. You could pronounce it if you like. And it means if and only if. Okay, but so Y is a true successor of X if and only if, says John Williams. First of all, Y has to be a temporal successor of X. Y needs to be later on in time than X. And two, here's some symbolism that's developed in this literature. S sub Y describes the set of beliefs and practices that Y kind of holds and performs, right? So the Y's set of beliefs and practices is qualitatively similar to a very high degree to the beliefs and practices of S, right? So to be a true of X, yeah. So to be a true successor of somebody, you need to be after them in time. You also need to hold beliefs and practices that are, very similar. Some people have argued that that's not enough. There needs to be some sort of causal relationship between. So it needs to be the reason that Y has beliefs that are so similar to X is because X held them, right? So why does Wittgenstein have beliefs that are so similar to his teachers? Although he didn't really. But why does Wittgenstein have beliefs that are so similar to his teachers? Oh, because he met his teachers, and that's part of that might be part of a more full definition of succession. So that's roughly how John Williams defines what it means for one person to be the successor of another person. Then David Hillel Rubin used what Williams had said to define his relationship, which he calls inheritance, which is about not just people, but traditions. And he says, Y is an inheritor of X's tradition. So, Pope Francis is an inheritor of Pope John Paul's tradition if, i.e. if and only if, one, Y is a true successor of X. So first of all, Francis would need to be a true successor of Benedict. Second, Y develops his beliefs and practices because X developed his beliefs and practices where this because signals some sort of causal influence. So unlike Williams's view of succession, David Hillel Rubin thinks it's a really important element of being the same tradition over time, that there's some sort of causal connection, which, by the way, go back to my diagram way back here, you'd think causation is going to be part of the story that links the baby to the old man here, right? So there's a kind of analogy that causation is also going to play a role in making it the case that the traditions that Pope Francis represents, stands for, believes, practices, are an authentic continuation of the traditions that Benedict or John Paul held or manifested. Now, along came me. That's not me. That is Moses. It's the Simpsons representation of Charleston Heston's representation of Moses. But for our purposes, it's Moses. I came along in 2013. No, I mean, I'm older than that. I entered this debate in 2013. And what I argued is this. Look, really what it means to be a successor is this. Sam Lebens develops a set of practices and beliefs, so I'm Y. And I did it after Moses developed his sets of practices and beliefs, okay? But what makes me, Sam Lebens, a true successor of Moses? And I wanted to just say this. Well, look, if Moses could somehow be brought back from the dead right now, initially he'd be pretty shocked. You know, he'd see lots of... Okay, before we read that, let me tell you a little story. Arnold Toynbee was a British professor of history, and he was something of an anti-Semite. And at one point in time, I think more than one point in time, he referred to Judaism as the Jews as a fossilized people. They're no longer living. They're not really a real nation or community anymore. They're somehow dead. And he had a debate on this issue with Rabbi Dr. Jacob Herzog, who I believe was the uncle of the current president of the State of Israel, who was a great rabbi and a great academic in his own right. And they had a debate. And in the course of that debate, Herzog said something which I think is almost demonstrably false, I'm afraid to say. It was very, very good rhetorically, but it wasn't very accurate. What he said is the following. If Socrates was brought back from the dead right now, and you took him to Athens International Airport, the Greek people walking around the airport would barely recognize his language, because ancient Greek is so different to modern Greek, and he'd ask where the nearest temple to Hermes is or whatever, because he wants to go and libate wine or something, and they'd say, sorry, we don't do that around here anymore, and that would be the end. But, said Jacob Herzog, if Moses would rock up to Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv, he'd speak in the language of the Bible. It would sound a bit odd to the local Jews, but they'd get it. And they say, where's the temple that I can bring my sacrifice? They say, sorry, it's been destroyed, but you can still go and pray to God, and you can say, the Shema, which is a prayer you wrote, Moses. You can go and say it, in the synagogue down there. You'll get it. It's fine. And we're still wearing the phylacteries that you told us to. And Moses would recognize contemporary Judaism much more readily, says Jacob Herzog, than Socrates would recognize contemporary Greek culture. Now, there may be some truth to that, but if there is, it's very little, right? I mean, so we wear phylacteries today, practicing Orthodox Jewish men. Some women do, but standardly Orthodox Jewish men wear phylacteries. But there was a massive debate in medieval Judaism between Rashi and his grandson, the Rabbeinu Tam, as to exactly how the internal design of the phylacteries, which design the phylacteries should accord to. And so then you could ask, well, which did Moses wear? Did he wear Rashi's tefillin, or did he wear Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin? Right? It's just, I mean, Moses wouldn't even be able to read Hebrew today, right? Because we use a different Hebrew we use a different script, right? So it's really not as convincing as Herzog made it sound. But this you could say, if you brought back George Washington to America today, there are lots of things he wouldn't recognize about the way American society is structured and the way laws are written and passed. Lots of things he wouldn't recognize. But you'd be able to explain to him how the Constitution was amended in line with the Constitution as it was first written, and he'd say, oh, I get it. I see how we got to here. In fact, and he'd say, yeah, that's the country that I might not like everything that was changed. I might like some of the things. I might like some of the other things. But I get it. Yeah, this is a continuation of what we started. And Jacob Herzog knew very well that there's a famous story in the Talmud, in Tractate Menachot, that pictures Moses transported into the future, into the classroom of Rabbi Akiva, who was a first century Palestinian Jew. And brilliantly, the Talmud imagines that Moses is sitting there not understanding a word of what Rabbi Akiva is saying. And it's very disturbing for Moses, right? Completely unlike Jacob Herzog's rhetorical flourish Toynbee, the rabbis who wrote Masechet Menachot said, no. If Moses was in the classroom with Rabbi Akiva, he wouldn't understand a thing. And in the story, he's very perturbed, Moses is. Until, some way through Rabbi Akiva's lecture, a student raises his hand and says, Rabbi Akiva, where did you get that idea from? And Rabbi Akiva said, oh, it's a tradition from Moses from Sinai, right? And Moses didn't even recognize it, but in the story, Moses feels much better. Why? Because he's egotistical? No. Because what Rabbi Akiva is saying is, or what the story is saying, is even if contemporary Judaism is very different to what Moses practiced, there's a story to be told about how the contemporary practices evolved from the practices of Moses, and if only it would be explained to Moses, he'd be like, oh, okay, I get it, just like George Washington in my example. So I want to say that what makes my tradition a successor of Moses' tradition is something like this. If you brought Moses back to life, initially he'd be shocked, but if you were to kind of explain it to him, he would see why as his successor. He would approve of why as his successor. I didn't write it properly there. Okay. Now that's individuals, but you can now talk about a whole tradition. So let's take the Jewish tradition over time. And let's just say you can imagine the Jewish tradition spread out over history, and we can slice it into contemporary slices. So you've got time slice X, which is like all the Jews at T1, and time slice Y, which is all the Jews at T2. I want to say they belong to the same community, called the community Z. They belong to the same community if, that's if and only if, one, there exists a founder or founders of Z, call him Moses. And that founder or those founders would recognize both time slices as true successions of their tradition. And that's what we're really arguing about. Now, when I made this suggestion, I call it's a suggestion based on what I called counterfactual approval. If you could just only bring somebody back to life, and when I wrote this up, David Hillel Rubin criticized it and said, "Don't worry, we're still friends." He criticized it and said, there's no way of knowing whether these counterfactuals are true. How could you possibly figure that out? And very kindly, the late John Williams defended me against David Hillel Rubin and said, no, David, you're missing the point. One of the things you wanted to explain, David, is why these debates are so intractable. And one of the reasons it's so intractable is you can't just bring these people back to life. But if Moses could be brought back to life and everything were explained, I think his opinion would probably sway the, it might do, it might not. Okay. That was what I wanted to talk about. And then two things happened. The first thing is the organizers of the Perlmutter conference decided they were going to have a theme. And the theme was to do with technology. And that has nothing to do with that very technical discussion I've just introduced you to. That was the first thing that happened. The second thing that happened was I decided I was wrong in 2013, and I didn't have anything to say about the identity of communities over time. And I want to tell you why I think I was wrong. And it's a bit of a personal story, but we're all friends, so I'll just lay it on the table for you. I have a 15-year-old son at home. Lovely, wonderful, charming young man. But he and I have some differences, as you can expect. Between a father and a 15-year-old son, there are sometimes differences. And this slide here depicts some of those differences. You see, my son at the moment is going through something of a crisis of faith in terms of we're an Orthodox Jewish family and we practice Jewish customs in our house, but he's not so sure that he believes, which is fine, and I want to give him room to be his own person and find his own way in life. But you see, the picture on the right of this slide, as I'm facing it, so it's left, of the Sabbath table, a Jewish family partaking in festivities together on the Sabbath table. That's how I want to kind of acculturate my son and my family into the practices of Judaism. The picture next to it is basically what my son spends all his time doing. He just sits on the computer, immersed in a completely different community. Now, actually, he doesn't go on the computer on the Sabbath. He has enough respect for the practices of our home. He just sits on the couch while we're all at the table kind of singing and talking about the Torah. He's just reading some Neil Gaiman or something on the couch. But most of the time, when it's not the Sabbath, he's just on YouTube the whole time. It got me thinking, and I read a paper by Celine Arfini, who's an Italian philosopher, and it was co-authored with a number of other thinkers in 2021, about the sorts of crises of identity that a person can have when they've basically got two identities, an online identity and an offline identity. And it can sometimes even cause a crisis. She imagines a story of a guy on a dating app. I don't think my 15-year-old son's on a dating app. I do try to kind of oversee his exposure to things, but who knows? But in the example in the paper, there's a man on his name's Sam, actually, but it's no relation, I think. Not my son. I mean, my son is related, but he's not called Sam. In the paper by Celine Arfini, there's a person called Sam who's not related. And he goes onto a dating website, and he has to kind of put in his details, okay? Now, his details are disappointing to him because he's in the thought experiment, he's a fabulous violinist. He really is. He's a really good violinist. But he can't find work. It's hard to find work in violin during a corona epidemic. So instead, he's like an Amazon delivery man, right? So what do you put on your dating app, right? You know, it forces you to confront perhaps the things about your own identity or situation which you don't like. And it might even tempt him to be a little bit liberal with the truth as he puts his details into the dating app, and he constructs an online persona, which is something like the person he wants to be, the person he projects to the world. And then there's the person that he really is, as we say in Yiddish, Nebuch, who just doesn't live up to the online project. And this can cause something of a crisis. And it got me thinking about a number of issues to do with the creation of community, the maintenance of community, and the creation and maintenance of the friendships and interpersonal relationships which play a role in the creation of community. So I got reading about the philosophy of the internet, and this is all the fault of doctors John Malkovich had nothing to do with it, Simchovich and Novick. So I got reading in the philosophy of the internet. So very, very early on in this literature about the philosophy of the internet, there was a paper in 2000 by Cocking and Matthews who said, no, authentic virtual friendship is impossible. All this stuff that my son's doing online, no real friendship, because friendship depends upon what they call, in the paper, non-voluntary self-disclosure. Because when I'm having a conversation with you, I might stutter, or I might have certain hand gestures that I'm not really thinking about. And in virtue of a lot of these kind of gestures that I don't really control, I disclose more than I could if I was just writing on MSN Messenger, or whatever it was, AOL Messenger, or whatever it was in the early days of internet chat rooms. And real friendship depends upon many other things, but one of which is non-voluntary self-disclosure, which requires physical presence. Now, that view is no longer taken very seriously by most scholars because the technology has improved, okay? There's a really nice paper and then a book by Shannon Valler. The paper is called Flourishing on Facebook, in which she argues that, no, virtual friendship really is possible, but it's also actually very difficult. Because of the sorts of things that Cocking and Matthews were worried about, it's still difficult. Michael Lopato, as late as 2016, talks about the phenomenological absence of the other online. So there's a whole tradition. You think of Martin Buber, I-thou relationships rather than I-it relationships, to relate to another person as a person rather than as an object. Peter Strawson talks about the reactive attitudes that you have to persons in contrast with the reactive attitudes you have to objects. Levinas talks about the idea of obligations that you have to others emerging from that face-to-face encounter. And Lopato thinks there just isn't the phenomenological presence of the other. The other is somehow too distant when it's an online interaction. And indeed, in a paper of 2020, Michael John Turt writes, it's adopting the objective attitude rather than a personal attitude. It's what makes us more likely to engage in online harassment, hateful speech, profanity, threats, flaming, cyberbullying, cyberstalking, griefing, and trolling. There are all sorts of behaviors that proliferate online conducted by people who don't tend to act that badly when they're not online. Why? Because of the phenomenological absence of the other. It's basically easier to bully somebody if you don't see them cry, right? That's basically the idea. We may also be more likely to engage in forms of disrespectful and polarizing discourse that have come to characterize too many online moral and political conversations as early as 1981, before the rise of the internet. Susan Wolf, who's always been a very prescient and insightful philosopher, asked us to imagine the following: a world in which human relationships are restricted to those that can be formed and supported in the absence of the reactive attitudes, which basically means human relations mediated so that you never see a person face to face. A world in which human relationships are restricted to those that can be formed and supported in the absence of the reactive attitudes is a world of human isolation, so cold and dreary that any but the most cynical must shudder at the idea of it. And that is my son's life in front of his computer screen. So cold and dreary that only the most cynical wouldn't shudder. But no, that's a very, very negative view of online relationships. And in a paper in 2012, Munn argues that friendships require mutual caring, intimacy, and shared activity. And it's possible to have all of those online. He compares online games such as World of Warcraft with standard forms of social media such as Facebook. The latter, he argues, are incapable of independently providing a realm in which friendships can develop. Often, the most robust Facebook friendships are actually continuations online of underlying face-to-face relationships. But he does think the former, things like World of Warcraft, really can allow for the formation and sustenance of friendship because it's people doing things together, achieving things together, failing to achieve things together, going through, trials and tribulations together. Okay, they're all fictional trials and tribulations online, but it's a shared experience. And of course, there's research about if the voice is involved. So on a lot of gaming platforms, you can hear the actual voice of the people you're playing with. And research suggests that just the presence of the voice in the ear can evoke much more empathy for other people than purely text-based communication. And in a really wonderful paper by Lucy Ulser, who's citing the work of a 20th century German phenomenologist called Gerda Wolter, Gerda Wolter had a 4-part conception of these things she called we experiences. We experiences are, look, I can experience you as an object. That's kind of a third personal experience of another person. I can experience you as a thou. That's like a second personal experience of you. But I can have an experience with you. Like, imagine that you and I go to the cinema and we're old friends and we're watching a movie together and there's a stranger in the third seat along. There's a sense in which you and I would be sharing the experience with one another and not with the stranger on the third seat along, because we've gone to the movie together, we're aware of each other, we're intentionally doing this together. It's what Walter would call a we experience. And she says that we experiences need 4 ingredients. 1 is common intentionality. That means they need to be attending to the same thing, in this case, the same movie. 2, there needs to be reciprocal awareness, which means I need to be aware that they're watching the movie. They need to be aware that I'm watching the movie. I need to be aware that they're aware that I'm aware. And this iterates up. We're aware of the other one's awareness, and this is reciprocal awareness. The 3rd is interdependency, which means that the experience would be different were it not for the other one's presence. So the experiences we're having, the qualities of those experiences depend upon the experience of the other. That's the 3rd ingredient. And the 4th is what we could call a reciprocal affective requirement, which is that we both feel part of a we, right? And it needs to be reciprocated. You can think you're having a we experience when you're not, because you can think you're part of the group, but no one really likes you, right? That's really sad. In that case, you're mistaken about whether you're having a we experience. You're not. At least according to Walter, for Walter, we experiences require this reciprocal affective requirement where all of the parties involved in the we experience care about the fact that the others feel that they're part of this we. She also makes a crucial distinction between what she calls actual we experiences and habitual we experiences. I think a more modern way of describing that, a more contemporary way of describing that might be between a current we experience, like one you're having right now, you're really aware of it, and a kind of dispositional we experience. Like as I walk around the world, especially because I wear this head thing, and I've got my tassels dangling, as I walk around the world, I'm kind of somehow aware that I'm a Jew, especially when like people in the diaspora you sometimes have, it doesn't happen too much in Israel, it would be weird, but in the diaspora you sometimes have people roll down their window and say, Jew! And I go, oh yeah, I am, right? So sometimes other people will point it out to you, but generally as I walk around, I'm not like vividly aware of being a Jew, but it's somehow there in the back of my mind. She calls that a habitual we experience, because I kind of view myself as part of a group, and it's always there in the background. That's different to an actual we experience, which I might have, when I'm dancing Have a Nagila with other Jews in there, that's more of an actual we experience. Okay, because that's what we do when we get together. We all dance and sing Have a Nagila. Okay, so what do I take from this slide? What I take from this slide is that I'm wrong to dismiss too quickly the sorts of experiences that my son is able to have on social media. He can have real friendships. He can have real relationships. And he can find himself a part of a community. I used to think, the picture of the Sabbath table and the picture of the computer can never compete with the Sabbath table. But it can. And it does in the lives of young Jews today. right? And I'm sure similar things could be said about young Catholics today, right? That there are online communities which are more attractive to them, more available to them, more cool for them than the communal experiences perhaps offered to them through their membership of a church. And it's something that we, as Jewish thinkers and as Catholic thinkers, need to think about, okay? And the reason it's related to the original question is one of my ambitions as a parent is to transmit a tradition to the next generation. And there's competition, because I have a tradition that I want to transmit to my children, but there are other communities on offer and other identities on offer. Okay. The next thing I want to think about is some of the risks of online communities and friendships. There's a philosopher, Tai Nguyen, who is a brilliant philosopher who works on the philosophy of computer games. Dr. Simkovich, will you tell me when I'm like, I've got to stop? Because yeah, okay, good, okay. Tai Nguyen talks about the philosophy of computer games, but he has this fabulous paper about Twitter, where he talks about the gamification of communication. Now, gamification is where you take something from normal human life and you basically turn it, through the aid of technology, into a computer game. And sometimes it's really useful. For example, and I was talking about this earlier today because I was practicing my lecture on you, Duolingo. Duolingo is a really great app, a popular app for learning a language, but it basically makes it into a game. There's this like computerized bird and you want to make it happy, and then after a while you're not sure whether you're doing this to make the bird happy or to learn French because you know, it's become a game, okay? Or the Fitbit, which is a gamification of exercise. It counts your steps. You're like, well, how many steps am I going to do today? And before long, you're so, you know, you want to be on the top of the leaderboard, right? There are online competitions of steps. You're no longer doing this to get fit. You're playing a game now. It's how many steps can you accumulate, okay? And you might even cheat, right? Because you just want, you sort of win. So you like, you know, like jiggle it around or whatever to try and, you know, build up those steps. Now, gamification increases our motivation by changing the nature of the activity. Right? We've changed the nature of exercise. It's now chasing after steps. We've changed the nature of language learning. It's you know, prizes and points in this game called Duolingo. Now, often the goals of ordinary activity are rich and subtle. When we gamify these activities, we change those goals to make them artificially clear. Because the value of a healthy body is a very, very rich value with all sorts of, it just becomes, oh, how many steps did I do today, right? And that's it, right? So something that was once subtle gets replaced with something that's artificially clear, and that can be useful. Fitbits are great, and no one's saying anything else about, you know, Nguyen doesn't have a bad word to say about Fitbits. But he does think that what Twitter does is to gamify not fitness, not language learning, but communication. Twitter gamifies communication. Now, why is it that we engage in communication? What are the values that animate human communication? Well, they're really rich and subtle. I couldn't list them, there are too many. Some of us want to transmit, this is a quote from Nguyen, some of us want to transmit information, some of us want to persuade others, some of us want friendship, some of us want to join together in pursuit of truth and understanding, some of us want self-expression, some of us want, it's endless. Twitter only has 3 values: retweets, likes, which are both short-term, you know, did they like the actual tweet that you gave? Or followers, which is a more long-term, you know, those are the only 3 values. 3 values. That's it. It's completely finite and very artificially clear. Twitter, so he says, Twitter gamifies discourse, and in so doing offers us re-engineered goals for our communicative acts. If you like, you can tweet and become a very successful tweeter for none of those subtle values that we spoke about before, self-expression, truth, persuasion, community. You could just be doing it for the likes, or you could just be doing it for the retweets. Twitter gamifies discourse, and in so doing offers us re-engineered goals for our communicative acts. Twitter invites us to shift our values along its prefabricated lines. We start to chase higher likes and retweets and follow accounts, and those are very different targets. Another quote, if I could, I would just read this whole article to you. But anyway, another quote. For one thing, we have evidence aplenty that what makes something go viral is not its truth. What makes a tweet a popular tweet? And it's not the degree to which it promotes understanding. Right? Recent studies have shown that tweets loaded with strong moral emotions like outrage are far more likely to go viral via an effect that research calls moral contagion. No one goes on Twitter saying, I'm going to make the most subtle point I can. Right? Nobody does that, right? And if it did, it wouldn't go viral. Oh, that was so subtle. That's not what's getting. Subtlety is not contagious, sadly. Worse still, gamification tempts us to change our goals, to aim at expressions which maximize our score, rather than those which aid our collective understanding. And it promises to reward us for that change with pleasure, because it's really fun to be liked. And we are pleasure-seeking beings. So instead of truth, ultimately, on Twitter, we're after that rush of seeing that you've been retweeted, that someone likes you, especially if it's someone famous retweets you. Wow, right? It promises to reward us for that change with pleasure. Twitter tempts us to subvert the activity of earnest conversation for hedonistic reasons. And what you see online is echo chambers. Okay. Now, Nguyen's also done a lot of work on defining echo chambers and actually distinguishing them from what he thinks is a much less harmful phenomenon called an epistemic bubble. An epistemic bubble is what happens if you're just living in, I don't know, white middle-class America. There might be certain experiences you're not exposed to, but you're not shutting yourself off from them deliberately. And you would change if only you saw certain things. That's the consequence of living in a bubble. But echo chambers are much more dangerous than bubbles for the following reasons. An echo chamber is defined in terms of two things. To belong to an echo chamber, first of all, you need to subscribe to a certain belief, a belief system, the belief system of the echo chamber. Number two, the belief system in question has to include the belief that all non-members are untrustworthy and that all members are trustworthy. And the reason these are so vicious is because, first of all, they're really attractive. Because if you belong to one, you get to feel smug and right all the time. And that is a nice feeling, right? So they're attractive. They're also sticky. Once you find yourself in one, it's really hard to get out. And there's a reason why. By their very nature, they inoculate you against counter-evidence. Why? Because the second characteristic of an echo chamber is that it includes the belief that outsiders are untrustworthy. So as soon as an outsider gives you evidence, you know not to trust them. So for example, if you, and they normally have what Nguyen calls epistemic priming, where the members of the echo chamber will warn you what opponents will say. So when the opponent starts to say them, you become confirmed in your belief of the echo chamber. Ah, they told me you'd say that, right? So for instance, in anti-vaccine echo chambers, they'll say, you know what, the doctors and health professionals will tell you that these vaccines are good for you, but the only reason they're telling you that is because they're involved in big pharma and they get paid, and they tell a convincing story. And then you go to the doctor says, you know what, you should really take the vaccines, they're good for you. More evidence that I'm right. Right? Because I was told that I was going to be told this. And guess what? I was told it. So the conspiracy theory must be true after all. So they're sticky. They're attractive and they're sticky. Now, like Twitter re-engineers communication to be about pleasure rather than truth, echo chambers involve re-engineering their members' belief system and trust settings for pleasure. It's fun to be a member of it can be scary, right, to be a member of a conspiracy theory, but it's also really attractive because there's a certain type of pleasure in feeling that you're right all the time. I know because I am right all the time, and it's really fun. But, that's because I'm actually right. The third thing I want to talk about, and you should trust me, the final thing I want to talk about before I move to conclusions is moral outrage. Now, on this, Nguyen and Becca Williams have worked together. And Nguyen here summarizes. They have this phrase called moral outrage porn. And I think it's quite actually ironic name. I'll try and explain why. I think it's an ironic name in a moment. But the idea is that pornography is a representation of a sexual act. And the consumers of pornography are able to enjoy, they get sexual gratification from the representation of a sexual act, but without the attendant risks of real sexual intimacy, okay? And moral outrage porn is similar in various ways to real porn. Let me explain. Moral outrage porn is the representation of moral outrage. So I look at a Twitter where someone's outraged. I look at a tweet in which someone's outraged. And I engage with that tweet for the immediate gratifications of feelings of moral outrage, just like somebody might engage with a representation of sexual intimacy for the sexual enjoyment. You can engage with the representation of outrage for the kind of frisson of enjoyment that you get from being outraged. For instance, the pleasures of feeling smug, secure, and confident in the total wrongness of the other side. But in moral outrage porn, rather than real moral outrage, they somehow do it while avoiding the costs and consequences of genuine moral engagement. They're morally outraged, but without the pains of struggling to be morally sensitive, the efforts of seeking the right moral beliefs, the exhaustion of real moral action. Now, if one's interested in using moral outrage porn for pleasure, you're going to have an incentive to adopt not the right moral system, but the one that's easiest to crank for pleasure. Just like you can become a food junkie, an adrenaline junkie, you can become an outrage junkie. You start to enjoy being outraged. And that's going to give you an incentive to adopt a moral universe that's more prone to be outraged, right? So one will likely be tempted to say, adopt a simple and absolute moral system, because that will give you the easiest access to the pleasures of smug condemnation. Promise you, Malka, this is the last piece of big text. Crucially, our claim isn't that moral outrage is bad. That would be like saying sex is bad, because pornography is. No, moral outrage isn't bad, even if moral outrage porn is bad. The reason I think that the name moral outrage porn is a bit ironic is because I feel that Nguyen and Williams here are now using the word porn for its shock value, and it pulls you in. But that's kind of the sort of sensationalism that you expect from moral outrage porn. So I think there's a kind of irony in calling it moral outrage porn. But that's the name now. And they don't want to criticize real moral outrage. They say real moral outrage is crucial. I have this amazing memory I'll never forget. I was with my wife in Swaziland. I said I'll never forget it. I can't even remember where it happened. I was with my wife in Swaziland, and we were on a political tour of Southern Africa. It's no longer called Swaziland. It was called Swaziland when we were there. What's it called now? Something else. We were there. And we visited the house of a man in rural Swaziland who was dying of AIDS. And the king of the country had 15 wives. And he had built a palace for each one of his wives and bought them each a chauffeur-driven Mercedes. But there were no roads in the rural areas of the country. and he couldn't easily get to a hospital to access the antiretrovirals that had been donated by the Global Fund. And even if he could have got to the hospitals, he would have had to pay a tax to the king to access the antiretrovirals that had been donated to him. His wife had already died of AIDS, and when he would die, his children would become orphans. And there was a myth in the rural areas of the country that the way to cure yourself of HIV/AIDS was to rape a virgin. And his orphans were going to be left in that situation, in that country. And after we left his house, feeling desperate, the tour guide said to us, "I took you here because I want you to feel angry." And to this day, I mean, it's 20 years ago, it's one of the most powerful, really one of the most powerful moments in my life. And I think one of the reasons it was so powerful is that I come from a tradition in which Maimonides is venerated, and Maimonides would always say that anger is the one thing you should, everything should be in moderation apart from anger. You should never, ever, ever be angry, maybe only feign anger. No, I felt that the tour guide was right, and that if I'd interpreted Maimonides that way, Maimonides is wrong, because if you fail to be angry about that sort of situation, it must mean that you are not sensitive to all of the details of that situation. Anger is the appropriate response to that situation. A certain sort of anger, right? So outrage is an important thing to be able to feel, and Nguyen and Williams know that. Moral outrage, when it emerges from a well-tuned moral sensibility, they say, helps us to register injustice, it motivates us to end it. The very problem is that moral outrage porn threatens to corrupt the real thing. The proper target of moral outrage is the genuinely outrageous. But when we use moral outrage porn, we use our own moral outrage for pleasure, and so we're incentivized to change our moral belief system, to ignore truth, and adopt those beliefs that will give us the most pleasurable outrage. Moral outrage porn invites us to instrumentalize our moral beliefs. Now, I'm almost finished. I want to share with you my preliminary conclusions and hypotheses. Where has this journey taken us, right? I started off thinking about what makes one community the same community over time. I kind of run that discussion into a dead end. I then told you I don't know what to do about my son who spends all his time in his bedroom. I'm trying to communicate a community to him that I think is vivid and living and brilliant and ancient and wonderful and wise and righteous, but he's just on YouTube the whole time. And I used to think that, it should be easy to compete with that because you can't have real friendships, real relations, real communities online. No, it's not true, you can. But there are real risks with online friendships and online communities. First of all, I think it's preliminary conclusions and hypothesis. Communities overlap and nest in interesting ways. So you've got the Christian community, okay? Nested within the Christian community is the Catholic community, the Protestant community, nested within the Protestant community is various subforms. You've got the monotheistic community and nested within that. And then you've got overlapping communities, like you might have the community of Democrats, which includes, which overlaps with Jews and Catholics, but sadly, or maybe not sadly, depending on your politics, not all Jews and Catholics. But you've got overlapping communities, you've got nested communities. And if, like me, you're a metaphysician, you're like, what are these things? How do you individuate them? It's a bit of a mess, right? Because you can hold so many of these identities at once. For instance, there's being a member of the Jewish ethnicity. There's being a member of Orthodox Judaism. There's being a member of, the Jewish Woody Allen Appreciation Society. I don't know, whatever it may be, okay? And these are overlapping identities, and each one of them needs its own kind of metaphysical story. Okay, I want to say that each community, every single community in this overlapping network of communities, whenever you focus on one community, however coarse-grained the community or however specific the community, it will have a founder or founding members. And, even if it doesn't really, it might be a useful idealization of a more complicated underlying phenomenon if we just imagine that they do, okay? And what we're interested in when we're tracking the identity of a community over time is what would those founders recognize, okay? Now, the type of similarity and/or the type of causal connections that are going to count as glue between earlier and later time slices of a community, and perhaps the type of glue that sticks members of a community together at a given time, that's going to be highly variable from community to community. For some communities, you're only a member if you have the card in your back pocket, right? For some communities, you're only a member if you've been, well, if you're a man, you've been circumcised. It's not worth it. Well, I don't know. I only had 8 days to find out, and I don't remember them. So it's going to vary from community to community what it is to be a member, okay? Also, what it is to transmit membership across time. You know, the American Constitution, for example, it changes in different ways to the British Constitution. Each founder, I suppose, would recognize, and actually what's really interesting is the type of glue can change over time, right? That's to say the American Constitution could be radically changed by amendments, right? And to the point that it would be really hard for George Washington, if he's brought back, to recognize current political institutions as a continuation of his until it were explained to him, the causal path of how, because the glue has changed so much over time. Okay. This leads me to think about a hugely influential paper by a Jewish historian called Chaim Soloveitchik called Rupture and Reconstruction. And all I want to take from it is the following. He seems to think there are certain times in which the Jewish tradition has been transmitted mimetically. You grew up in a Jewish home, you saw Jewish practices, you just imbibed it with your mother's milk, the rituals of Judaism, the beliefs of Judaism, the kind of neuroses of Judaism, all of it, right? The oi and the ochs of Judaism, everything. You just imbibed it in your mother's milk. That's the mimetic transmission. And then there have been periods often after massive ruptures like the Holocaust or tremendous migration of populations across the world because they've been fleeing from pogroms or whatever, in which the tradition was transmitted by fidelity to texts. You opened up the legal law book and you find out, okay. And that, to me, seems to be like the glue between generations changes. Sometimes the glue is mimesis, and sometimes the glue is fidelity to textual traditions, for example. Which leads me to my conclusion. It's hard to have a conclusion if you're not quite sure what your question was. But I'll say this, right? I started off with like a metaphysical question, right? What makes a community the same community over time? I haven't really changed my mind all that radically since 2013. I think it has something to do with what the founders, even if they're an idealized group of people, would recognize as their inheritors. But what I recognized is that, you know, communities are such a diverse group of human groupings that it's hard to say anything that's not very, very general about what they share in common at all. And that, you know, online communities are just as real as offline communities. And indeed, online and offline communities can be mutually reinforcing. What I just want to say is this. Some communities at some points in time are typified by a mimetic transmission. You become a member and you learn how to be a member by copying other members. The transmission is typified by an orality. It's not about reading texts, it's about hearing stories and whatnot. It's typified by the phenomenological presence of the other. You're there at the Sabbath table, or you're there, you know, in church together. And therefore, you have the actuality of a we experience. Those we experiences that you're having, like the ones I have when I'm dancing, have a nagila with the other Jews, there are communities where those actual we experiences are common. And I think that all of those tend towards communities with subtle, flexible, and moderate values. And that's a picture, by the way, of Chaim Soloveitchik. And I think this is very much inspired by what he says in this paper what was it called? What did I say it was called? Rupture and Reconstruction. Well done. There are other communities, or the same community sometimes at different times in their history, which transmit membership over time through fidelity to a text. Yeah, this is the last slide, you see? Fidelity to a text, where actually the other is very often absent. I'll tell you what, I know what that's like, because I kept the Sabbath as an observant Jew in Leicester, in England. I don't know what you know about observant Jews or Leicester, but the Venn diagram of observant Jews in Leicester is very, very small, okay? Leicester had about 20 Jews living there. I mean, I was the only observant Jew under the age of like 93 in Leicester as a teenager, and I kept the Sabbath on my own, right, in my room, because my family didn't keep the Sabbath yet. They became observant later on. Right, the other was phenomenologically absent, okay? And the we experience was habitual but not actual. You felt that you were part of a group, and you knew that other people would accept you as part of that group too, but you very rarely got to meet with them, right? And I think that when those things typify the transmission of a community. And this is because, especially when this is going to happen online, we've spoken about texts. Texts are just much less subtle than mimesis. And I suppose that lack of subtlety is just amplified on certain forms of social media like Twitter, where where moral outrage porn, echo chambers, and the gamification of communication proliferate very naturally, and they become very, very tempting. And that's why I think that those sorts of communities are going to tend towards quite extreme and polarizing views, right? And I think it's no surprise, by the way, that the most radical forms of fundamentalist religion are very, very good at recruiting online, right? And less good, perhaps, at recruiting in embodied communities. So those are some of the things I've been thinking about. Like I said, I don't really have a question, but when I figured out what the question is, I think I've got some interesting answers. And I think what we as both Jews and Catholics wanting to transmit a tradition on to future generations, we have to think about the technologies that can supplement but not replace embodied communities. And we also need to think about the risks that are attendant upon these virtual communities and try to mitigate those risks as parents and teachers and as guardians of a tradition. Thank you.